Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Jenny Stuart. I'm the Vice President of Consulting at Construx Software, and today I'll be talking about overcoming common scaling dysfunctions, some of the common issues and challenges we see, as well as some techniques, approaches, and practices for you to consider to address those. So a little bit about why Construx is doing these lunch and learns. Back in 2009, during the recession, Construx introduced something called the SPEAR program, and there we were giving people who had been laid off for some reason during that period of time access to our free public seminar seats in our public seminars. And we wanted to do that as an opportunity to give back to the software engineering community that we've been part of for so very long and is so near and dear to our heart. With all that's happening now through the coronavirus and so many people working from home and unexpected disruptions and changes through their lives, we wanted to do a lunch and learn program for people. And we wanted to do that for a couple reasons. One was just an opportunity for something a little bit different from your day in and day out activities that you're doing, but also an opportunity for something that could be more team oriented or team building. So the opportunity to take these together, virtually together, and then meet afterwards to talk about some of the techniques, practices, or ideas that you've learned from the lunch and learns. So we encourage you to join us for these. We encourage you to share the program. You can find it at construx.com/lunch. Share that with other people and join us for these. We'll be doing them until the end of April. So hopefully you'll find some opportunities for some things that you can do together remotely with other people from your organization or other people from your software engineering community. We've had a little bit of an issue with Q&A, so you won't see Q&A in this session, but we do encourage you to ask questions throughout. Please send those questions to Eric Simmons at construx.com. That's Eric with a K, E-R-I-K .Simmons at construx.com. And we will be answering questions throughout and certainly pausing for a Q&A at the end as well. But please ask those questions anytime they pop up into your head. Do know that if you want to pause the event for any reason, you can hit the space bar. So if it's accidentally paused on you, try hitting the space bar. If you actually want to pause it, you can hit the space bar. You can also back up through the presentation if you'd like. And these presentations are all available in Construx on-demand ecosystem several days after they have been presented. So the whole library and catalog of these will be available for you to share or to relook at a later time. So what is one of the challenges? Why are we even talking about scaling dysfunctions? Well, we're talking about scaling dysfunctions because large projects are fundamentally harder. Large projects have more dependencies to manage across a whole bunch of teams. Large projects have way more product backlog items or queue items that we need to manage, and we need to prioritize those. It gets harder to get good estimates across a whole number of dispersed teams and across a whole number of different backlog items to try and have a good idea of how large this effort is going to be. It's much harder to get overall good progress visibility. How do we know when we're halfway through, we're really halfway through? That becomes much more challenging at scale. How do we get stakeholders involved? We don't now have maybe a half a dozen, maybe we've got 50 different stakeholders, and how are we going to make sure we keep them engaged, get their input, get feedback from them on an ongoing basis? And one of the things that we can see here is there's just a general pattern that as project size increases, the degree to which projects are challenged gets significantly larger. If you look at some projects in more kind of what you'd think of as a small usable business system, at that point we're looking at something where odds are better than even that you're going to deliver something on time, but there certainly are still potentially some challenges that can happen there. But as we start to move up, what you start to see is that projects, ones that people would consider to be a fairly large project, right, 500,000 to 1 million lines of code, well, there's a significant major jump in challenges for projects of those size. Where before we were talking about things that would most likely deliver on time, now we're talking about things where the rate of failure is about 30%, and on top of that, another 40% are likely to be late. So now we're really looking at a better and even chance that your project is going to be late or to fail. So project size definitely has a major implication on how challenging your project is going to be. And certainly we've all seen news items related to major project challenges, everything from healthcare.gov to the Denver airport to IRS modernization. Or my joke is this shows up in pretty much every major next-gen project I've ever seen in any organization. You're definitely challenged, you're likely to be late, some of those projects outright fail, and are canceled just because they're way past the point that people expected them to be delivered. And there's a whole set of dynamics that cause this. One of them is the fact that the project activity mix changes by size. So if you're looking at a project that's on the small side, you're looking at, say, 2/3 of that project's effort is really being spent in construction activities, writing the code, doing code reviews, testing that code. And if you move over into larger and larger projects, what you start to see is that's actually decreasing. We're looking at something where the other activities, architecture activities, end-to-end system test activities, start to really increase and take on a larger proportion of the effort. And so if we try and use exactly the same paradigms and practices and patterns that worked when something was small, and then try and apply that to a project that's large, well, that's just not going to work particularly well, because we need to be doing somewhat different things because the nature of the project work activity mix has fundamentally changed. If you're interested in more information about all of the different aspects and why size is such an important dynamic on projects, Steve McConnell did a lunch and learn several weeks ago, challenges of size, difference between small and large software projects. Or in our on-demand ecosystem, you can see his USP, his Understanding Software Projects lecture, and those will give you a really good sense of what are all of the different dynamics that really cause those failure rates and challenges to go up drastically as project size increases. So let's talk about some of the dysfunctions that we see and give you solutions for addressing those dysfunctions. The first dysfunction is building on a weak foundation. What are you starting with? Are you starting with something that looks really stable and strong and works really well? Or are you starting with something that's kind of weak and crumbling and already a little problematic, tilting to the side, a little unstable? I joked once in an organization who was telling me about the fact that Scrum wasn't working well, so they were going to go ahead and implement SAFe. Well, the Scaled Agile framework is built upon high fidelity Agile teams at the bottom of that whole infrastructure. So that's a real challenge. So we want to make sure that our Agile teams are in really good shape. First thing, we want to choose the right tool for the job. Not every team, not every situation calls for Scrum. Scrum's certainly used very heavily in lots and lots of organizations. In many places, it's the building block on top of which scaling is built, and that can work really, really well. But even in large organizations, there tends to be a place for Kanban as well as Scrum. A pattern I see in a lot of places is that you have Scrum for the feature teams or the product development teams, but then Kanban's used for teams that need to be a little bit more responsive. So these would be folks like the automation tooling team or the pipeline team or the DevOps team, teams who don't want to operate on a 2-week sprint cadence. They want to be able to give things back to the Scrum teams on a faster basis. So just recognizing that you may not always need exactly the same tool for the job, looking across your organization saying, in what places should we be using Scrum? In what places should we be using Kanban? Using the right tool for the right situation. Once we've chosen that tool, we want to make sure we implement it with high fidelity. So we want to make sure if we do Scrum well. We don't do things where we do Scrum, but we don't do sprint reviews. That's missing our product feedback loop. Feedback is a huge part of being successful in the small and in the large. So we want to make sure that we do this, we do it well, we allow it to support that scaling infrastructure. Similarly, if we're going to use Kanban, I want to implement a good high fidelity implementation of Kanban. I really want to model the workflow. I want to make sure that I understand the steps and stages the work moves through and make that visible. I want to introduce work in process limits so that I can really optimize the flow. In both Scrum and Kanban, I want to collect data to help me project when we're going to deliver. So be that cycle time or velocity, I want to make sure I have a good baseline for delivering. So make sure that the foundation is strong and that that's really in place is the first thing that you want to have. And again, if you have questions throughout, please email Eric Simmons, Eric with a K at construx.com. So the second dysfunction is having too many cooks in the kitchen. As the old adage goes, if you have too many cooks, they will spoil the soup. I worked with an organization once and they had about 2,000 people working on a product together, and every group of 1 or 2 Scrum teams had a product owner, and those product owners were giving the teams really what they wanted to build and where they wanted to go, but they had a really open-ended vision. They had one of those visions of build the world's best X product. And so all of the product owners all had great ideas. They were all implementing these great ideas. By the time I saw this project, they were 3 years into a 2-year project with no end in sight because no one said no to anything, and there was nobody ultimately making decisions across the whole group of people who were implementing all these ideas across all of these teams. So we need an ultimate decision maker. We want to make sure that we're all going the same place. We want to make sure that we're all aligned. We want to make sure we're working on the right stuff. I was in another organization that had 7 Scrum teams. They had 7 product owners. They also had this concept of feature owners. And when I talked to senior management about what was the most important thing to be building, it happened to be something that a feature owner was trying to shepherd through these teams. When I went and talked to all the teams, turned out the product owners were completely ignoring this priority and working on the stuff they thought was interesting. Because again, there was no single arbitrator who was really saying across the work of all of these teams, this is where we need to go. So we want to make sure that we have something like a chief product owner, an ultimate decision maker who prioritizes work across all of the product owners and all of the teams working on this product development effort. We also want to make sure we have a single master backlog. So one place that people who were thinking about this from a bigger picture perspective can go to see everything that we're doing. Now, individual teams won't want to see the 500 or 5,000 items in this master backlog. They'll really want their own view into the backlog, and all of the tools will support this. So payroll will have a view, and human resources will have a view, and the finance team will have a view. But if I'm the chief product owner, I can now also have a view across the totality of the work and to understand what everybody's working on and make sure that is appropriately prioritized and aligned. That product owner, that chief product owner, working in combination with all of the product owners, be they 5, 10, 15, 50, is commonly called the product owner council. And the product owner council is the body responsible for looking over that product backlog and making sure that the work is being appropriately prepared and then fed to all of the different teams so that the product owners can work with their individual teams to build the right functionality in the right time. The Product Owner Council builds upon team level refining. They're typically at least a full sprint ahead of when things are going to enter the team's refining because they're making sure that they're decomposing the work and looking at which team's going to get which piece if that's appropriate. They're responsible often for creating more acceptance level criteria at the epic level, or for you weren't safe, they'd be thinking about something like the feature level acceptance criteria. So that bigger picture, when all of these pieces come together, what are we going to be showing to our stakeholders? How do we know this has been successful? The Product Owner Council is really making sure that everybody's aligned on that activity. And of course, there may be times where they need technical assistance. So they may be reaching out to an architect or a senior technical lead or an architectural council or group to make sure that they're vetting things appropriately and grounding the allocation of work in a good understanding of what makes sense to give to what particular team. And if you're part of the Scaled Agile framework, the program backlog and the preparation for PI planning is kind of an equivalent for this. What we're seeing here with Product Owner Council refining is more of an ongoing activity that would be happening throughout, whereas in SAFE, you're looking at something that's more of a batch process, batching up everything that's going to go into PI planning. But in either case, we have a single consolidated list that we're going to give to a group of teams. We have a consolidated responsibility for deciding what the priority of that list is so that everybody's rowing in the same direction together to build the right product rather than individual teams working on things that they think would be helpful or useful but don't necessarily add up to a really important, useful product that we're going to be delivering. So our second dysfunction is having too many cooks in the kitchen, having too many people responsible for prioritization, decision making. We really want to make sure that there's an effective, useful approach with clear ownership for who is going to make those decisions in place. And the Product Owner Council typically meets 1 to 2 times a week. So I'd forgotten to mention how frequently they typically meet. And again, please feel free to email questions to ericsimmons@construx.com. So our third dysfunction is a weak product level quality focus. I had an organization I went into once and they were in their third program increment. So they were about 30 weeks into their effort, and they had 20 teams they were trying to bring everything together for, and they were kind of closing down their third program increment, and I started asking them things about, okay, can you show me your product? Give me a system demo or a product demo. Show me this whole thing working. And they told me they couldn't, and yet they were planning to finish one program increment and start the next one. And I ended up going in and really pulling the ripcord and saying, whoa, 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 more functionality on unstable baseline is a bad idea. You're just piling more on top of more. You don't know any of this works at all. Let's stop the bleeding. Let's make sure that we actually have something that works well before you just add more things on top of it. So we want to make sure that we have the individual teams working well, but also those teams are contributing towards a high quality functioning overall product together. Because what we don't want is we don't want a project that ends up in what we've always called infinite defect mode, where you're at the late end of the project and all of a sudden you're in a place where every time you find and fix a defect, you introduce one new defect. This happened in spades in a lot of the organizations I worked with and saw when in the waterfall days, and is something I really thought that a shift in the industry to Agile would magically fix. It just wouldn't happen anymore. But I see all sorts of crazy things happening. I've had an organization once where they brought me in to implement Scrum, and really what we found out was they had already, through the Agile approach that they've been trying to use, basically delayed their integration until the end. I had another team where they would start a release and 7 individual Scrum teams would all check out code, and then they would work on that code for 8 or 9 months and then integrate that code. And they called it Agile, they called it Scrum. I told them that was really waterfall. Really what we want to be doing is building upon the idea of a workflow in Kanban where we're incrementally delivering value on top of a stable system, or Scrum where at the end of every sprint across all of our teams we're building a stable product so that we can find and fix these defects early so that our releases are much more predictable and deliver a much more higher quality. So what do we want to be thinking about here? Well, obviously, one of the things we need to think about is our technical practices. What are we doing from a unit testing perspective, an integration testing, a functional testing? A great technique is doing test-driven development, where we actually write the unit tests before we write the code. But making sure that there's a good amount of automated testing at all of the different levels, using something like Mike Cohn's testing pyramid with a real baseline of unit tests. On top of that, there's integration tests. On top of that, there's automated testing of the end-to-end workflow. And at the very tip of that pyramid is manual UI testing, but there's very little there. Static code analysis tools. Most organizations who are doing really good things in continuous deployment and DevOps have a lot of both automation for testing and a lot of static analysis tools and other automation to help make sure that baseline is working all of the time. Automated regression testing, making sure that we feel like anything new we've implemented hasn't broken something that was working before. Coverage metrics, making sure that we have a good sense of how much coverage do we actually have in place. So make sure that your fundamentals are good here. Please don't be the team I worked with once whose quality bar was code written, checked in, hopefully unit tested. That way does not lead for really a good quality approach across the overall product. One technique that people will use is to create what's often called a gold standard definition of done. This is a definition of done that applies across all of the product development teams, or is a gold standard definition that gets used on Scrum teams in DoD and gets used on Kanban teams in their exit criteria for their stages, but a real shared understanding of everything we expect everybody to do. And when I work with teams to build this, I have representatives from all of the teams come together. So we really create a standard that is the baseline. Teams can expand beyond that baseline. They can add more to it. They can't take anything away from that baseline. You can't be weaker than the standard. So you need to make sure that everybody buys in and agrees to it. One big anti-pattern I've seen here is a gold standard that was created by somebody who would like a team to do all of this stuff inside the sprint boundary, but they can't. And so they just ignore it. So that shared understanding of what's our minimum bar across all of our teams. Our third solution is to make sure that we're integrating code often. And here's where things like the CI/CD, continuous deployment, DevOps push has been really helpful in the industry, making sure that we are consistently and regularly converging this work. Hopefully on a daily basis, if not on a daily basis, then at least within the sprint boundary, making sure that everything is merged and everything is tested and the whole product looks like it is shaping up well and looks very stable. We want to make sure that we've got a stop the line mindset. If something breaks in this, it's really important that we don't just keep adding more stuff into it, that we stop and fix it and get our stable baseline back. So that needs to be a focus that everybody cares about, and everybody puts first, and everybody thinks is really important. So the goal is a stable working system all the time. We want to make sure that we always have this. And you'll see in a lot of the scaling frameworks, there's a focus here. In Nexus, you've got the Nexus integration team. In SAFe, you've got the system team. So sometimes there's some teams needed to support doing this, but the teams are responsible more for actually adding the infrastructure, and the responsibility for the integration still lies on the individual Agile team. Another thing some teams need is they need what's sometimes called a system test team or a parallel testing team, a team that's really taking the work that gets completed out of the Agile teams and validates that the work across all of those 5, 10, 50, 20 Agile teams is working correctly, and then feeding back either issues or new work that needs to be done. The key to success here, though, is that the Agile teams still need to do the majority of the testing. The Agile teams own unit testing, component testing, functional testing, integration testing, exploration testing. The parallel test team or the independent test team is doing testing that the development teams, the Agile teams can't do yet, or is too expensive for them to perform. So they're performing things like end-to-end testing, where I have a feature that was developed in one team and a feature that was developed in another team. And now I want to look at how those two flow together to provide an aspect of user value and make sure that user value chain or user value thread is really working in the way that we expect. Or they're doing performance testing where there's specialization either in tools or specialization in techniques that's necessary in order to do that testing successfully, and not every team can do that. So you want to make sure that the right kind of testing is being done in the right place. You would never want to have the Agile teams pushing testing into the parallel testing team, But in many organizations, especially if you're trying to bring the work of 20 or 30 teams together, there's a certain level of testing that's hard for an individual Agile or Scrum team to do. And so you will need a parallel testing team that's operating at the same time as the Scrum teams and really providing feedback on these things that would be hard or expensive or impossible for any one individual team to do. And the goal here is for an ongoing process with rapid, quick feedback, again, to that spirit of what we saw in trying to find defects sooner throughout the process rather than letting those pile up towards the end. One of the phrases I've always loved is the idea of shift left. We always want to be shifting left to try and find issues or defects earlier as much as we can. And solution number 5 is to handle your technical debt. Don't forget that it exists. Explicitly capture your technical debt. Let that be part of your product backlogs. Think about how you're going to address it. What's the technique that we're going to use here? Is it going to be a percentage of every sprint? Are we going to allocate a sprint on a regular basis? Are we going to organize it product backlog item by product backlog item? Is it going to be a percentage of each project or each release? A lot of organizations I work with here kind of steal the concept that SAFe uses, where every program increment, there's a percent allocation for enablers and technical debt. You can say do the same thing in a release over release basis, either doing that as a percentage of every sprint or allocating a certain number of sprints along the way. But just making sure that gets appropriately added to the backlog, prioritized, and there's agreed upon approach for addressing the right stuff. Obviously, we may need to make sure, just like everything else, that we're addressing the technical debt that's causing us the most concerns, challenges, or issues. So that's dysfunction number 3, is making sure that we think about the whole product quality effort as we go. Dysfunction number 4 is Yanni. You ain't gonna need it gone wild. As we noticed earlier in the diagram about project activities, you will certainly notice that as projects get larger and larger and larger, architecture becomes more and more of an issue. So the you ain't gonna need it where the architecture will just emerge. A team of one, a couple teams working together closely, collaboratively, sure. 25 teams working on a shared product together, you probably need a little bit more infrastructure than just that. So decide, how are you going to handle your architecture? I see a lot of organizations where there's a chief architect or a solutions architect or a program architect who's really the person making sure that in conjunction with other teams and team members, they're providing the right guidance and the right approach. Some people will do a dedicated architecture team, and a lot of teams I've worked with, the chief architect is on that team. That team is building things like in SAFe, the architectural runway, or is just working in conjunction, building some of the core microservices or core patterns that they're going to want the other teams to use in their microservices. So this isn't a dedicated architecture team that lives in an ivory tower way off away from the teams. This is somebody who is doing work that the teams are going to be consuming in the next few sprints, in the next program increment, something that's really going to give the teams the jump start they need to do their work right on their individual Agile teams. Some people will put in place what's called a virtual architecture team. So this is really headed by the chief architect or equivalent, and is a group where you bring together members of different individual Agile or Scrum teams together to think about things like what's our as-built architecture specification? Is any of the work that we've just done or about to do change that, and do we need to update that? Making sure they're part of the product owner council to give them input. This team may be taking risky items to prototype into individual Scrum or Agile teams to do that prototyping to bring back, or to work in conjunction with 2 teams to test out something across those 2 teams to validate that it's going to work. So the virtual architecture team isn't a formal reporting structure, it's more of a working group. Some people might call this a guild if that's a term that you like better, but it's more making sure that we have the connection of representatives across all of the Scrum Agile teams working together with a single head who's really thinking about What do we need to do? Where are we going from a technology perspective? What's our technology roadmap look like? How are we infusing that in? How are we making sure we're building up enough architectural runway? Explicitly investing in the architecture. So that's our second solution. Now that we know how we're going to do it, how are we also going to explicitly do that investment? What are the strategies that we're going to use? Are we going to have an enterprise architect who gives us guidance? Are we going to have technical roadmaps that come in through a chief architect? Are we going to use the concept of a safe architectural runway? In my experience, all of these strategies can all work well and all work bad. It's about looking at what you do today and picking the strategy that makes the most sense for you, and then really using that, making sure that it's actually effectively implemented and put in place. How are you going to handle that architecture work? Is it its own individual set of epics and features that are being prioritized? Is it a small group of teams? Are we going to have a small group of teams that's providing more guidance? So just understanding what pattern works for you. This is something where Scrum really doesn't have anything to say. Kanban really doesn't have anything to say. It's about sitting down and thinking through what's going to work best in our organization, being a little thoughtful, and then just implementing that and evolving that. If it's not working, then have a conversation about why and what we need to do to make things different. And then last, how are we going to allocate it? Again, is it going to be a percentage? Are we going to do individual decisions? And all of these patterns can work well, assuming that you actually have thoughtfully applied them to your organization. So just recognize that you need to make sure that you're doing the right amount of architecture work in the right places as you go along. Just don't assume that architecture will magically happen. It won't. I've been in organizations where there was nobody minding the architecture at all, and everybody was wondering why the 6, 7, 10 teams were all having such challenges to actually do the implementation. They didn't have the right amount of architectural underpinnings. So our next dysfunction number 5 is not having enough of a big picture view. Are you looking at the bark on a tree? Or are you looking at your path through the forest? Do you know how you're going to get from where you are now to delivering that product out into your marketplace? I really want to be able to see the product taking shape over time. I always ask people who aren't in the DevOps world where we're just continuously adding things to an existing product, if you have releases that last for 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year, when you're halfway through, are you halfway through? Can you see half of what you built? If you can't, I guarantee you're not halfway through. So I don't want a bunch of puzzle pieces that I don't know what that means. I know there's a bunch of work, but I don't actually know if I'm halfway through my product. I want to be able to see my product taking shape throughout every single sprint over sprint over sprint or PI over PI. One way we've been doing this for a long time, and all of the Agile frameworks have it, is the idea of a shared cadence. So we don't have teams who have different sprint cycles. Today, generally, when we're at scale, individual teams are on 2-week sprint cycles. That sprint cycle starts and ends on the same day across all of those teams so that we can make sure that we build upon that with a couple of product level events. And the product level events are typically a product level sprint review. And this is the idea of a review of the work across all of the teams. It focuses much more on the bigger picture. It's not looking at every single individual product backlog item built across each and all of these teams. It looks at what are the features or epics that are coming together across a number of teams. It occurs every single sprint. It may supplement the team level sprint reviews or it may replace it. So if you look at scaling frameworks like Nexus and Less, it really replaces it. The culmination of a sprint in those scaling frameworks is a product level review where you're looking at the work that was built on the product across all of the teams and you're focusing on that. If you look at SAFe, it has a system demo that occurs within the next sprint. So at the end of sprint 22, each team will do their individual sprint review. Over sprint 23, you'll be doing a system demo across all of that work. And again, either pattern can work. Most organizations I work with start with the idea of it's a supplemental activity that happens. And as they get better and better and better and closer to things like continuous delivery, continuous deployment, it becomes something that actually begins to supplement, replace what the individual Scrum teams are doing. So we want a point where we can look at the work across all of these teams, because this is what the stakeholders care about. If I'm your stakeholder, I won't want to go to 15, 20, 30 sprint reviews. I want to go to one, and I want to go to the one that shows me the big picture. I want to see that I have a half of a puzzle built. Show me the pieces you've added to that puzzle. Show me what is going to be compelling and interesting to our user community, so that I can give you feedback on that. And that's really what this product level sprint review is about. The next thing that we want to do is a whole team retrospective. I get brought in a lot to help teach and coach Scrum teams and Kanban teams, and I always joke that yes, there'll be a list of things that the individual teams need to do. That list is going to be maybe, a half a dozen things that they need to be working on. But if I'm looking at 6, 7 or more teams, I'm going to come back with a list of larger issues that no one individual team can fix. They're really what I will call system issues that need to be addressed by leadership, management, and a larger group of people who have a larger authority and a larger span of control. And that's what the whole team retrospective is getting for us. It's the opportunity to have a representative from all of our individual teams come together, talk about what worked, what didn't work, but from more of a cross-team perspective, what's getting in our way across all of our products, projects, efforts, teams together. Identify what one thing or maybe two at the most we can do to help make sure that everything's working better. And this might be about how do we handle dependencies, or it might be about how the decomposition of work is going, or there might be something about the build infrastructure. No one team can maybe fix the build infrastructure or the deployment pipeline, but we know we need to put a little bit of effort in that place. And so how are we going to go about addressing that? This is generally held every single sprint, or if that just feels like it's a little too fast, you can start off with once a month. I don't recommend that you do this only, say, once a program increment if you're doing safe. I think that waiting 8 to 12 weeks to do an inspect and adapt across all of your teams is too infrequent. I want to do this more often because I really want to be tracking and understanding what I can do to enable all of the teams working on my product together. So those are a couple pretty easy events to put in place that build upon the individual, say, Scrum team activities to help you have a much better view of the big picture. The other thing I am a huge fan of is modeling the end-to-end workflow of my program using Kanban. This is really where I think Kanban sings. Kanban at the individual team level is wonderful, but where Kanban really provides a ton of value to organizations is looking above any individual set of Kanban teams or Scrum teams or a mix of those teams and looking at what happens from when an idea comes in or when a feature arrives. What's the workflow that goes through until something is deployed in our users' hands and we're validating that they're getting what they expected and needed and wanted out of that. So whether you're 10 teams, 20 teams, 200 teams, really looking at that overall end-to-end workflow, modeling it, visualizing it, and allowing you to have a much better understanding of what's happening across all of my teams. Kanban is a great thing for that. If you want a little intro to Kanban, we did a lunch and learn a couple weeks ago that gives you a bit of an introduction to Kanban. We also have an on-demand class on a Kanban overview that can give you a better sense of how Kanban can help you in this particular area. But this is, in my way, the best way that I can solve that problem of I want to see the path through the forest, not the bark on the tree. Let me model this end-to-end workflow across all of the teams and watch how work is flowing across all of those teams. Usually here I'm looking at something more like what's the epic or feature workflow. I'm not looking at the individual product backlog items of the team. I'm looking for that bigger picture view. Our final dysfunction is death by dependencies. Sometimes you can feel like you're trying to untie a Gordian knot when you've got 15, 20, 30 teams who have interdependencies. When I work with organizations, one of the first things I'm always trying to do is figure out if I can dissolve some of those dependencies. looking for some techniques that allow me to eliminate or completely remove certain dependencies from even having to be dealt with anymore. And then where I can't, looking for activities that allow me to be ahead of the dependencies, proactively thinking about them versus reactively handling them. So these are all things I want to think about when I'm looking at some organization who has a fair amount of dependencies to them. One of the first things to look at is just our team structure. Can we prefer geographically co-located individual Agile or Scrum teams? In the time I've been in the industry, I've seen a shift from in the early 2000s, teams were almost all individually co-located. It was really rare to see geographically distributed teams, geographically distributed organizations. Time moved on, situations changed. Now we saw way more geographically distributed teams, but geographically distributed organizations who had also geographically distributed their teams. So an individual team would have 3 or 4 people in maybe the US and 3 or 4 in the UK, or 3 or 4 people in the UK and 3 or 4 people in India. We've realized that makes communication harder. We've got time zone issues, we've got cultural issues, we have language issues. And so one of the big shifts that I've been seeing over the past 5-ish years or so is our organization is still geographically distributed, but we prefer intact teams in each geography. So instead of having teams with team members scattered across the globe, we have, say, 5 teams in Boston and 10 teams in San Francisco and 15 teams in Bangalore. And so each of those teams is a geographically co-located team, but the organization itself is still distributed. The biggest challenge here tends to be the product owner. So often we'll see a co-located team, but the product owner needs to be remote. We see this a lot in India, where the domain knowledge lives in, say, the US or lives in Europe. And so the team will have a Scrum Master and it'll have all the team members, but the product owner lives in another location. And there we just need to talk through what's going to work best for us. So if you're a Scrum team, we want regular refining meetings. Some teams will set up things like office hours. When do we know people will be available? So when is the product owner available for conversations with us? Working agreements, potentially time shifting, or just being flexible with people. I had a team once that everybody was in Houston except the product owner who was in Germany. And they decided to do a lot of their meetings at a time that I thought was pretty late. It was about 9 p.m. her time in Germany. And we were having a conversation. I turned to her and said, "Is that okay with you? Are you comfortable with that?" And she said, "Yeah, actually, it works great for me. I go home, I have dinner with the family, I put the kids to bed, and then I get online and work." And I'm like, great, that sounds wonderful. So just being flexible and finding things, the pattern that works best for each individual team, and recognizing that from team to team to team, those patterns may look somewhat different. But biasing as much as we can towards individual co-located Agile teams. Being able to use feature teams as much as possible. So a team who really can work across all the different architectural layers or aspects to be able to deliver value by themselves. The shift and move to microservices has made a real big impact for a lot of organizations in this area that has been really powerful and really helpful. So being able to have teams where they can run with something. There isn't a dependency with another team because they own soup to nuts. Actually building that is a huge step towards dissolving dependencies. Now, certainly not every organization can go all the way to every team being completely able to work by themselves in a particular feature or epic area. But the more we can do that, the better. The more we understand where we can do that and which areas are going to have dependencies that we need to manage, the more we can kind of make that Gordian knot not a Gordian knot as much. Or maybe we can just actually slice the Gordian knot and all of a sudden it's not an issue for us anymore. So searching to have this as much as we possibly can. Some amount of forward-looking planning. It can be very helpful rather than trying to react dependencies as we go, doing a little bit of thoughtful planning. So this may be Scrum with release planning, where we're planning out the release for the next quarter. We're building a story map and we're talking about where are the dependencies, making sure that as we build the initial backlog, we've identified those dependencies, we've sequenced the work appropriately. Or this might be something like using the Kanban that we had set up to help us understand as something comes into that very early refinement or very early analysis activity. One of the things we're going to do there is understand what those dependencies are so that we can move the work into a team in a way that's sequenced logically per the dependencies that we have. Or this might be the safe program increment planning. A big thing that safe PI planning is about is identifying and creating a program board that talks about what those dependencies are. So making sure we're doing enough forward-looking planning so that we're thinking about the dependencies before they happen rather than just reacting to them. Obviously, actively managing our backlog, so doing things like dependency linking. All the tools will allow you to link this item as dependent on this other item. If you have a lot of dependencies, doing some impact assessments to really understand, do we think we understand what all of these dependencies really are so that we can link them or create dependency lists. So again, proactively thinking about it. And then last but not least in our dependencies is Scrum of Scrums. And I think about Scrum of Scrums much more as a tactical, this is kind of the day in, day out. The dependency has happened. Now we're reacting to it. Oops, what are we going to do? So everything up until now has been trying to either dissolve dependencies or proactively get ahead of them. And Scrum of Scrum steps in as a nice activity to do to help us now on a day-to-day basis manage those. Very early in Scrum in like 2003, we were talking about Scrum of Scrums as how you scaled Scrum. Hopefully you've seen through all the things we've been talking about here, there are a lot of other considerations beyond just having a Scrum of Scrum meeting that you should be able to think about to help you identify issues and proactively deal with them to make the Scrum of Scrum meeting maybe something that you don't have to have 3 times a week. You only have it once a week because there aren't as many dependencies for you to deal with. And Scrum of Scrums is just a regular meeting with representatives from each Scrum team, and they're talking about what has my team done since we last met, what are we about to do, what might get in our way, what help do we need from another team. And the meeting here is typically something that happens 1 to 2, maybe 3 times a week. Some organizations will combine it with a product owner sync and call it a core team meeting. And that's a perfectly fine technique and approach to use. So, in conclusion, scaling works best if we have a high fidelity adoption at the individual team processes. So if you do Scrum well. If you do Kanban, you do Kanban well. Build upon a solid foundation that makes everything else a lot easier. If my teams aren't producing potentially releasable increments at the end of every sprint, how can I possibly have a potentially releasable soft product? So make sure my individual teams have a good adoption of their selected agile approach. Structure the teams as much as you can to support individually co-located teams that can produce working software so that they have that opportunity to really be able to do soup to nuts something without relying on a ton of other teams for them to get that work done. Recognize that Scrum as a framework is an individual team framework. So when you're scaling Scrum up, you really need to be talking about other processes, other product level roles and events. Things like a chief product owner, things like combined sprint reviews or whole team or whole product retrospectives, Scrum of Scrums, chief architects. There's other things that Scrum doesn't have that you're going to need to be able to successfully scale and to do that well. Conduct the appropriate amount of forward-looking planning. This varies a lot. The level of forward-looking detail that some organizations need is really a few sprints ahead of them. Other organizations are still doing year-long hardware, software combined releases in things that are regulated, and so they have much longer planning horizons. So do the appropriate amount of forward-looking planning, use the technique that works best for you. Make sure you're thinking ahead of times about things like dependencies and how are we going to sequence the work so that I can see my product taking shape sprint over sprint over sprint. And then finally, seek to build a releasable product every single sprint. Folks who are pretty far on the DevOps journey, you're already there. Some organizations, especially organizations that have large, mature legacy system, this becomes a set of activities that you need to address, things you need to implement, things you need to get better at, like automation and the build pipeline and the CI/CD pipeline to help you move towards this goal. But this should be the goal. If you build potentially releasable product every sprint and you can see it, then you've really addressed all of the issues that you need to be able to scale successfully. If you've got 1,000 people, but at the end of every sprint, you can see your product, you're in great shape. And that's a place I want everybody to get to. That journey might take you a few months, that journey might take you a few years, but it is a journey every organization should be taking in order to really make sure that they're producing high quality software throughout. Eric.
Yes.
Eric Simmons has joined me, and I thought, have you gotten any questions for us?
I have a few lined up. Anybody who hasn't submitted, we have the email. We're having a problem with the Q&A here live. So erik.simmons@construx.com. If you send it somewhere else, I won't see it. And if we get questions that we don't get to before the end of this live event, we will get back to you offline after the event is over.
Thank you, Eric. That's an excellent ad.
So let me combine a couple things here and say that scaling obviously is difficult. And it would be hard enough if we had sequential opportunities to do larger and larger projects from scratch. But there's this huge pile of spaghetti, Gordian knot, pick your metaphor, of existing architecture and code. And now, on top of that, we're going to add feature teams because we want to expand scope. And by the way, we're going to undergo some form of agile transformation because we're going to adopt Scrum or Kanban or SAFe elements or something that we've never done before. And all these other things are going on. How can I know? What in your experience, what are the best ways to look for it? We're looking for the sort of warning lights on the dashboard that something is very wrong with my project, and how do I find that out early?
So for me, it always comes down to that. I jokingly said it several times. You know, if you're halfway through, can you see half of what you built? For me, that's always the real test. And if I haven't, then what do I need to do? What's the smallest amount of stuff that I can do to get me the best visibility as quickly as I can? And certainly that varies a lot from organization to organization. And that question's a little hard for me to say, here's the one thing you can do. But if I don't have that visibility, for me, that's the biggest red flag.
Okay. And the follow-up to that is, with this massive investment in previous existing architecture, which people, have we ever heard someone describe it as this nicely wrought, beautiful architecture that's easily extensible? Well, no. It's a pile of spaghetti on a good day, and sometimes we hear lots of epithets in the general direction of previous architecture. So,
and don't forget the area that dragons live.
That's right, the RB Dragons. Now, how can teams know whether they're in about the right balance of sort of what Steve Taki calls perfective maintenance, going back to that architecture and trying to right some of the things that are now wrong, even if they were right at the time, versus new development? And how do I allocate my resources to get the best forward motion?
So a lot of that comes down to what kind of pain the company is experiencing. And generally, my experience has been people will sort of nod their heads at, yes, we have a problem, yes, we have a problem, yes, we have a problem, until the business starts to say, ow, I think we have a problem. And then all of a sudden the conversation becomes quite different, and we end up having a conversation about what percentage of our effort are we going to invest in this. And so I always say to people, rather than just saying, hey, we've got architectural issues or we have a ton of technical debt, can you find things that are causing business pain because of that? And can you share that with people and get people to buy into it? Because Eric, I'm sure you've seen this. A lot of times people will say that yes, we know, yes, we know, yes, we know, until they reach a point where that architecture or that infrastructure, that technical debt has become really big and is going to be really painful to start paying off. So I try and see if I can find early warning signs or early pain points that I can get other people. This is often folks like product managers. Can I expose them to the small pain points that's happening so we can start to incrementally pay that off as we go? I've never found a place where people suddenly get, yeah, you've got a 6 months release and all you're going to do is re-architecture work. But certainly if I can do 20% rather than waiting for another year and a half and all of a sudden I'm spending 50%, if I can get that exposure and get people talking about it sooner, that's always better.
Mm-hmm.
And
I do like the idea of,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I do like the idea of trying to enlist business stakeholders in this decision and letting them weigh in, because what typically happens is the business folks are always pushing for more features and the development folks are saying, please, please, please let us reduce this debt before it kills us. So finding ways to educate them and make them proponents of appropriate debt reduction and re-architecture work sounds great.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing is, we need to make sure we're not re-architecting just because we want to re-architect. That we should be able to link it to a business reason, right? If we do this, this is the outcome and this is the reason that it's beneficial for us to do it. Right.
And you talked to forward planning too, at least establishing some forward planning so you can start to limit this problem in the future. I remember hearing a keynote from Vince Cerf at an IEEE requirements conference back in Monterey in 2003, I think. And this is one of the people, unlike Al Gore, who can say, I invented the internet. So after his keynote, the first question was inevitably, given what you know today, what would you have designed differently about the internet? And his answer in total seriousness was everything. So having some forward planning and being able to anticipate the requirements for the future is often helpful here too, because you have to know something of where you're going, or any direction will do.
Well, I also like the idea of if you really, really want to build something that's reusable, you're probably going to need it built for 3 different solutions before you know it's truly reusable.
Yeah. All right, and the last thing here is that we'll probably have time for today is related to team size and advice, because clearly there's a combinatoric explosion of communication pathways as we grow the team. While we can't necessarily eliminate that problem, do you have any field 1 practices for how best to enable good communication as team size grows? What do we do? What do we not do? And is it dependent on Agile or not? I'm pretty sure it doesn't. It's more
I guess, is there any context or background about that makes it a little more specific? That's kind of an open-ended question.
It is. It sounds like people are struggling just with the basic practices of communication as team size proliferates. So one thing I had thought of as I read this question was making sure that your statuses are always fresh. I like pull-based systems like a Kanban board where somebody can go to the board physically or digitally, and the board is up to date. The board tells what status is right now, as opposed to everybody having to take time to do a weekly status report and email it to somebody who compiles it. And by the time it reaches anybody who can do something about the problem, it's 3 weeks old and everything's changed.
So and I'm a big fan of exception-based status reporting, right? If everything's on track, I shouldn't have to be doing status reporting.
Yeah, that's another good one. Yeah, so pull-based, somebody should be able to go find out what the status is anytime they want to without you having to do any extra work. And really, exception-based communication makes sense too. I like even exception-based meeting. You send it out an email and communicate that way and say, here's what I'm planning to do. If you disagree, let me know and we will meet. But you don't hold a meeting just to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Sure, go do that. Okay.
And if you look at some of the things we've been talking about, like a chief product owner and a product owner council, you're also looking at adding some communication pathways above the Scrum framework. So
Right.
these are communication pathways and decision-making pathways. You can kind of think about it as, you know, a Scrum wrapper or a Agile wrapper around a whole set of Scrum teams or Scrum and Agile teams, right? You know,
Yeah.
we're doing some earlier planning in the backlog with the product owner and the product owner council, and then we're checking how that got delivered inside of the sprint level product review, and then we're checking on how that system is working across all the teams in our system level or product level retrospective. So those are sort of meta planning, communication, and checkpoints above a whole set of Agile Scrum teams.
Sure. And if the question didn't go there, but if we step a little beyond status, then I would also say that especially as we add these extra layers and focuses, having everybody have a crisp, measurable definition of success helps a lot, because it pushes all the decision making down to the lowest potential level. Rather than having to ask permission every time you do something, you have a very well-defined playing field. We tend to call them landing zones at Construx for success, where a team knows that they can make decisions in this space without having to ask permission. And there you cut down the amount of communication traffic, the number of meetings, just to rubber stamp decisions and things, and that helps a lot.
No rubber stamp decisions.
No, every team should have a very clear numeric definition that is visible to everyone for what success looks like and where failure begins after that, so that they know what they're on the hook for in a program increment or for the product overall, depending on the right visibility. All right, that's what I have in email, having combined those. Anybody who didn't get your questions in, feel free. We will obviously get the email after the session is over, but that's all I got for you.
And certainly you can email Eric, you can email Eric and I'm at jenny.stewart@construx.com, or you can email hello@construx.com.
We'll find
and please do join us for future Lunch and Learns and share these with other people, and maybe even